Hi, I'm Britton LaRue, and this is Moon to Moon. Moon to Moon is a space to consider, celebrate, and share the ways we come home to ourselves, anchor through change, and uncover our power. 1 month, one phase, one loving step at a time. Welcome to Moon. I'm Britton LaRue, your host here, and I'm so excited to be bringing you this episode where I'm inaugurating a new series here on the podcast called UNSHAMING the Houses. In my last episode, Grief is the New Shame, I talked about how I was bringing this project of UNSHAMING the Houses to Moon as an expansion and like the next zone of interest for me in my larger project of weaving what I'm learning about shame and unshaming with the language and the medium of astrology, especially as a medium to open our hearts through conversation, through connecting, through vulnerability speech, through personal storytelling, which is really the way that I've always related to astrology. So if you've listened to the last episode, then you know that I'm going to be bringing on a different guest astrologer to talk about each of the different houses. And for Unshaming the first house, I am bringing a conversation here with one of my favorite astrologers, Jeff Hinshaw, who you may know as Cosmic Cousins or through his podcast, Cosmic Cousins. Jeff is just been really important in my learning path. I was reflecting recently about Jeff, just sort of like through the magic of connections. I think it was either in Lindsay Mack's Tarot for the Wild Soul class, which I took, I think, fall of 2018. I'm pretty sure it was through that class. There was a Facebook community, and somebody had listed favorite podcasts on astrology, and someone had said, oh my gosh, I'm in love with Cosmic Cousins. So I went and checked it out. And for a good 2 years, I did not miss an episode. I listened in a period of time when Jeff was doing a project on Queens of the Zodiac, looking at different individuals by sun sign and bringing out their personal stories to help us connect with the essence of each of the signs. And Moon to Moon listeners know that I'm obsessed with the Zodiac, and it's like a never-ending love affair with the 12 signs. And so Jeff's voice brings me back to a time when I was just so hungry to learn. This is back when I was a baby astrologer, hungrily learning everything that I could about astrology. And Jeff's big heart really comes through his voice. And I'm so proud to be bringing Jeff's voice to my podcast here, Moon to Moon. This is actually Jeff's second visit to Moon. He came on Living the Fuck Out of Your Chart. That was summer 2021, I believe. And that invitation really initiated our friendship. it was a few months later that then I came on Cosmic Cousins, which was such a dream, the fall of 2021. And it was also in that window of time when I had my first reading with Jeff. And it was such an important time for me. I was very transitional. I was in a breakup period. I was moving houses and living at my mom's with my daughters, like back in the old bedrooms. And anyone who's had to move back home knows how like that is a time when there's like a lot of the past is up, and here you have this heart yearning for new futures and what you're visioning and building for yourself and perhaps your family too. And the past was very present and grief was very present. So it was really incredible to have this conversation with Jeff in a moment where I'm in grief again, which I talked about in the last episode. Grief is the new shame. And my life is a life that spirals regularly back to grief. You might be able to hear the rain. It's raining and I'm sitting by the window, letting it in. And as soon as we finished recording this podcast, I booked another reading with Jeff. And so since we had our conversation, I have now had another reading with Jeff. And once again, it's just so beautiful to be in Jeff's space, in Jeff's presence, with Jeff's genius, which is incredibly heartfelt, which I'm super into, weaving, our mental brilliance with the heart. That's what really makes me happy, and those are the humans that I most love to be in presence with. So Jeff and I feel sort of reinitiated into our friendship, and we are now even dreaming of future collaborations. So just a real joy to be able to share that with you before you listen to this. So as I discuss in Grief is the New Shame, what we're going to be looking at is the kinds of shame that can come up with the department of life, the realm of human experiencing that is signified by that house. When we think about astrology and you're like, but where is Earth? Where is Earth in the chart? Well, the Earth to me is the houses. The houses represent the terrestrial life, the terrestrial experience of being Earthlings here on Spaceship Earth. So each of the realms of life can be an area where we have stored, consciously or unconsciously, a sense that we're doing it wrong, that we're like shitty Earthlings, that like we're fucked up adults. And it can be an area where we're projecting into the chart are like an anticipation of a problem, an expectation of difficulty because we don't know what the hell we're doing and we're probably doing it wrong. Where we're like looking to the chart to represent some kind of signature of potential. As I like to say, there's no such thing as potential. Potential is a fantasy that shames the present moment. But like we talk about charts like it's going to help us, quote unquote, unlock our potential, as if the charts, each house has like a perfect way of doing things. Like it has if only we could just figure out how to do it better, if we were like more healed, if we just like kept working on ourselves, then maybe we do the chart, to the potential that it offers. But then we're also looking at the houses to like point out like where we probably are fucked up, like where we probably, it was written in the stars that we're failures. These are the things that I saw in the relationships we sweet humans have with our charts, which is how I got into shame and into unshaming. And so that's going to be our focus, house by house. And in this house, we are talking about one of the most important houses of the chart, arguably, which is the first house, which holds our rising sign, which holds our sacred ascendant degree, and is often associated with what we might call our identity. Our identity, like who we think we are, who other people think we are. So as you can imagine, shame is up. Shame looms quite large in the first house realm, quite large. And having sat with so many individuals as an astrologer or as an astrology teacher, as a mentor who has the chart up when we're having our session, the rising sign can be such a fraught place for experiencing shame. So here we go. Let's jump into it. Before I pass you over to the conversation, let me read Jeff's most recent bio to you, in case you're new to Jeff. Jeff Hinshaw, the founder of Cosmic Cousins, has made several contributions to the world of astrology. A vocal advocate for promoting inclusivity and diversity in the astrology community, he uses his platform to highlight the work of other LGBTQ plus individuals from diverse backgrounds. In addition, through his podcast, Substack, newsletter, and social media, he shares his knowledge of astrology, making it accessible to a wider audience. At the intersection of astrology and spirituality, Hinshaw explores the ways in which astrology can be used as a tool for spiritual growth and connections between astrology and practices such as meditation, yoga, and tarot. Emphasizing the importance of building community, Hinshaw is passionate about creating space to connect using the language of astrology. Thank you so much, Jeff. Thank you so much for spending time with me and for bringing your heart and your wisdom to this topic, which is so powerful, which is unshaming. So without further ado, I am sharing Unshaming the First House with Jeff Hinshaw of Cosmic Cousins. Welcome to Moon, Jeff. It's your second time here, I believe so.
Yeah, thanks for having me back.
Yeah, we did I think it was a Living the Fuck Out of Your Chart episode, and we looked at your chart. It was so fun.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, you had reached out to me for this very special topic that we're going to be talking about today. That is the first in a series. And you had kind of asked me which episode or which house would I want to be connected to. And I was like, well, you just asked me. It's the beginning of the series. I have Sun in the first house. Leo season is here. We're recording this during Leo season. So it just felt right to say the first house, even though I will say I could feel like tendrils of like shame coming up of just being like, oh, I'm going to be the first. And like, I won't be able to listen to anyone else's conversation to have like any kind of instruction on how to communicate about this topic. But that felt like part of it for me was to allow myself to be seen in the first house kind of way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that was actually going to be my first question for you is, what do you think it is about the first that drew you to it? Is it a house that really draws to you? Is it the solar light that you have there? Is it
Oh,
the readings that you hold for others? Like, yeah, I'd love to just dive into the first house and your choice.
yeah, my internet like dropped out, like I didn't hear any of that.
Oh no. I had a feeling like maybe there was a glitch.
Yeah.
Um,
I I'm wondering if it's on my end or your end. I missed what I missed. Like you were frozen on my screen. I wonder if I froze for a bit too.
okay. Well, I guess we could just start over or just pop
Yeah,
that question back or just
yeah, yeah.
rewind on the question.
I missed the question. Did you hear what was the last thing you heard me say?
I heard you get through it, but it kind of looked like you froze while I was talking. So I could just repeat the question.
Okay. Yeah, so yeah, well, what was the what was the question?
Okay, yeah.
I'm sorry.
Okay, coming back. Yes, you had just said that you felt drawn to doing the first house since you had first dibs.
Yeah.
And that was going to be what I wanted to begin with was asking you about that choice was what is it about the first house that drew you to it?
Well, maybe I guess I have a question for you before we get into that.
Hmm.
Could you, because you've explained to me the topic through texting and email, but I would love to hear where the idea for this series and this topic came from. And then I think I'll launch off of that answering your question, if that makes sense.
Totally.
Yeah.
So about um it was fall of 2022 that I was studying shame a lot. I was like in a deep period of realizing how shame was not only underneath so much of what was motivating my behaviors, my responses, my ways of doing things, especially most with my daughters as a parent, but also as a business owner, as a partner, and unseen. Like I didn't recognize that I was doing things and operating from a place of shame. I just thought that that's who I was, is to kind of like second guess myself, not trust myself, work really hard to keep somebody else happy because I'm probably doing something wrong or I probably owe them something because of what a terrible friend I am, parent I am, person I am.
Mhm.
And I had been in like a deep moving through the layers of that process and really being able to call it shame and then learning how to help myself because I was realizing things that, especially relationally,
Mhm.
for example, I received the love of a spectacular, delicious man
Mhm.
who I adore and like kind of the dream relationship that I've always wanted. But I was continuously second guessing him for
Mhm.
loving me.
Right.
And like inventing reasons why he should probably leave, he should
Right.
probably get out of it.
Mhm.
And just realizing if I don't address my shame, I'm gonna lose this love.
Yeah. Yeah.
And really just seeing it everywhere and realizing that as a space holder, as an astrologer teacher and one-on-one guide, that so much of the approach or like the lens through which individuals were seeing their chart was through the lens of shame, like expecting problems, expecting difficulty, expecting evidence of being fucked up.
Right. Yeah.
And so I was thinking about I love the sign, I love the zodiac. I have a workbook series, Living the Signs.
It's beautiful.
And thank you. And I was thinking about the signs as ways of being human, and that it's in the ways of being human that we assign problems to ourselves,
Yeah.
which is shame. And I realized what we need is an unshaming the signs. I want to talk about unshaming the signs. And so that was my huge series that I did
Mm.
spring 2023, starting with Aries, month to month for a whole year. And I still roll a lot of those teachings out every month on Instagram. And I did workshops, which I still offer now as recordings. So
Yeah.
unshaming the signs was my big approach.
Oh,
But I started to get people asking me, like, what about unshaming the houses? What
mm.
about unshaming with the planets,
Yeah. Yeah.
And so I've been thinking about that a lot. First, I had a strong boundary, like, no, it's the signs.
Yeah.
But yeah, I started to see this picture of unshaming the houses, really looking at these areas of life, these departments of being human, where we find
Yeah.
problems with ourselves.
Yeah.
And what would it be like to unpack the houses
Mhm.
with other astrologers, house by house, and
Yeah.
just open this conversation up with the astrological community through a podcast format, which is a different format than the format that I was doing on Shaming the Signs Inside. So
Yeah.
yeah, you were my first ask, and you could have chosen the 12th house, in which case we would be the last conversation
Yeah.
people heard. But because you dove right in with the first house, this will be the first one,
Yeah.
and kind of setting the vibe.
Yeah. I think it felt right for me for many reasons, but one being that my son is in the first house. And I do think that the sun in a birth chart will likely shine a light to where shame may come up, which I don't think is a typical like signification of the sun, but both Leo, ruled by the sun, and the sun for me do work around themes of shame. And maybe we can go a little bit deeper into that, which would maybe start to share my journey with astrology and how I became an astrologer, which it was first through the body. And I had debilitating stomach pains for years to the point that I couldn't stand up at one point where like I'd wake up in the morning, my stomach would be so tight that I would have to be like in a little fetal position, and I had all kinds of, upper endoscopies, like cameras put in me, like to figure out what was going on. And Western medicine couldn't figure out what was quote unquote wrong with me, right? Like as if there's something wrong with me. And it wasn't until I saw an acupuncturist and she put her hands on my solar plexus. So here's solar, the sun.
Mm.
And she was like, I want you to breathe into your upper belly. This is the first time in my life, I'm like 22 years old at this point, that anyone had ever invited me to breathe into a part of my body, which is just really fascinating for me to look back on. So she invited me to breathe into my solar plexus. And then she asked me, what can you tell me about shame? And when she asked me that question, it was like the floodgates open. I'm not one to cry typically. Double Aquarius, Virgo moon over here. Like I don't like cry like that. But there was something in her touching that part of my body, inviting me to breathe there, and then asking me that question. So this began to open me up to energetic body, to the chakra system. And the solar plexus is the center that is also connected to shame. So I studied psychology in undergrad. And then after undergrad, I did a year-long training with Anadea Judith, who is the author of Eastern Body, Western Mind. And so it's the psychology of the chakra system. And so she's named a shadow for each of the chakra centers. And she names the solar plexus, the shadow of the solar plexus is shame. And this is the center of ego and identity. And what she says in that book, Eastern Body, Western Mind, is that guilt is the belief that you did something wrong. Shame is the belief that something is wrong with you, that it's very personal. So the sun in our chart is the sense of self and identity. And in that book, she also explores language that I've like started to adopt into my astrology practice, which is energetic languaging. That's a chakra center can be excessive, which is like too much energy, exasperated. So an example here is like too much sun, too much Leo could be uh like shameless, like it's like
Mhm.
just shameless, but deficiency is like not a lot of energy flowing there, and that would be shameful in the solar plexus. So if you have a deficient solar plexus, it's shameful. If it's excess, it's shameless. And then when it's balanced, the solar plexus is actually joy and radiance. It can be confidence, but humor was the one that I always thought was interesting, was like when the solar plexus is open and aligned, manifests as humor, like not taking things too seriously, having a light heart, which is then when you'll start to see that the other chakra centers come into play. So when you were sharing your example of being in relationship with heart, is like maybe there's like a deficiency in the heart or an excess in the heart, which is contributing to a deficiency in the solar plexus. So it's like, oh, I'm not worthy of love, heart, and then there's shame. So all of the chakra centers are coming into play with one another. So that would be the downward flow going from heart to solar plexus. But also sacral is the one below solar plexus, which could be connected to one's sexuality, any kind of sexual trauma, which could be the sacral chakra. So I'm coming into this topic through the lens of embodiment and connecting to the body, because shame also lives in the body and it likely lives in our digestion. And so this acupuncturist, she healed my stomach things through just talking about breath, body, somatics, energetic awareness. Whereas before it was like I was like gonna have to have surgery, like what's going on with me? You know, there were all these things. So that opened up my practice with yoga, which then eventually led me to yoga, led to tarot and astrology, essentially. Yeah. But yeah, so I am inviting us into this idea of the solar plexus and the sun. And the sun is in my chart is in the first house. And we're recording this right at the start of Leo season. So if we're coming from like a horary perspective, and I'm kind of looking at the chart of today as also offering us insight into this topic. It is Leo season, which I think is a good time for us to be connecting to the first house. Yeah.
Mm. Thank you so much for inviting us to go there. I'm just feeling so connected to you and your voice and your work, and what an important teacher you were for me when I was very first learning astrology. And it's this approach that you bring through embodiment that is so powerful.
Mm.
I'm glad you took us there.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you. So yeah, you had a few definitions of shame that you shared with me in the email. I shared the one about shame as the belief that something is wrong with you, uh,
Mhm.
which is very first house as the self, right? Um,
Yeah.
so yeah, I'm curious for us to unshame the houses.
Mhm.
And the first house is important because it's the rising sign. Yeah.
So important. I think it's arguably the most important one, especially for the topic of shame.
Yeah. Yeah. So what's your rising sign? I think I know, but let's remind everyone.
Yeah, so my rising sign is Aries. It's a 3-degree ascendant.
Mhm.
And I think that it's interesting that both of us have rising signs. You said you're Aquarius rising, that are ruled by planets that we call malefic.
Right.
Um,
Right. Yeah.
and I think when I think about my journey with embodiment here, because I do associate the first house with embodiment, really embodying who you arrived here to be, sky meeting the earth and bringing those together. I think for me, finding out that I was Aries rising and being invited into astrology, it was like this whole journey of self-permission. And one of the things that comes up, I've learned from as one of the consequences of shame, is feeling like you don't have permission, feeling like
Mm.
you don't have permission to act certain ways, do certain things, embody certain things, be a certain way. Um, One of the ways that you know that the unshaming is working is you start to notice you're giving yourself more permission to just be who you are.
Yeah.
And so I think for me, learning how to have that like pointed sword out front as a very Piscean person who also just wants everyone to love each other and get along, and be absorbed into everything, being that kind of separator energy out front is like a walk. And I think that if we think about the first house as the helm, which is what the ancients often called it, like the front of the boat,
Mhm.
um, really kind of having that energy out front in an unapologetic, unshamed way is part of what the invitation is. But sometimes I think before embodiment is the experience of being in the walk of it, or the journey of it, and the embodiment comes with practicing.
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah. Yeah.
What
I mean, yeah.
what degree is your ascendant?
5.
5.
Yeah. So these early first decan
Mm-hmm.
rising signs. Um, yeah, when I think of Aries, I mean, what we've had Chiron in Aries, right, for the past few years. And Chiron is one of those placements in a chart that I really do think speaks deeply to shame. So it
Mm-hmm.
could be interesting for us to explore Chiron today some too. But really you can unshame all the planets too and talk about the planets through those lenses. Um, but the first house being this house of, you know, the way that I refer to it, and actually from a more like macro perspective of this topic and unshaming the first house also speaks to what house system you're using as an astrologer,
True.
which there can be shame around like that too, of like, oh, I use Placidus, and then someone else is like, well, I use whole sign. And so this topic also brought up just the calculating system, this
Mm-hmm.
first house. And even the words that we use as astrologers that may be adopted from more traditional modes of like malefic. That's how I unshame my practices. I don't like to use
Mm-hmm.
words that might place shame on something. And I think that's coming from someone who, as a sun in Aquarius, that is considered to be like a detriment placement. I also have Mercury and Pisces. Like my whole chart is like a
Me
detriment.
too.
Yeah. So it's like I am unshaming that. By
Mm-hmm.
finding new ways of talking about astrology, which I think is a very Sun and Aquarius in the first house thing to do anyway, is to help to make our vocabulary inclusive for all people so no one feels like they're wrong or bad or left out. Um, yeah, and there is the Saturnian side of Aquarius too, where there's like rules to follow and that there is use and describing a planet as a malefic, but does it exasperate shame when we say these words? And if so,
Mm-hmm.
what practices do we have in our own life to counter that?
Totally. I totally love this. Yes. Because from what I've learned about shame, it's a way of seeing the world through the lens of the good, bad binary.
Mhm.
And it's really the view of a child. Like it's the child's perception of the world of like, I did good or I did bad. Um, am
Mhm.
I in trouble or am I not in trouble? And so one of the things that I've discovered is that paradox is really supportive in breaking up shame, because paradox holds different things in both hands at the same time and lets them both coexist.
Mhm.
And I will say that for me, this is how I like to approach essential dignities and things like detriment, fall, and
Mhm.
malefic.
Mhm.
Holding in one hand the history that gives them those words a meaning, that we can all hear it and know what we mean. And
Mhm.
then in the other hand, looking at what's really loving, powerful, exciting, pleasurable, um, supportive about having certain placements, or having, like, how loving malefic planets are, for
Yeah.
example, which
Yeah.
feels paradoxical, but it's like supportive because it breaks up the story.
Right. And along these lines of like the binary of good and bad or paradox, I do think that there's something in exploring of one's polarities when working through shame. And I'm reminded of that today. Today is what I call my polar self day, because the sun's in Leo and the moon's in Pisces, which is the exact opposite of my Aquarius sun Virgo moon. And so I'm also just like reflecting on how this is my polar self day when I'm having this conversation with you. So I do think that there's something about polarity in unshaming the first house.
Hmm.
And some of that could be within the own zodiac sign that you have in the first house, of whether that is like as an Aquarius rising looking at Leo and how that, mirrors back to you relationship, because you were even giving the example as an Aries rising that shame was coming up in this relationship that you have. So the first house is inherently connected to relationship in the seventh house, and Libra being there would be important for you. But within an own sign, there is also the opportunity to look at the shadow of each sign. And I have a nice quote from Leo Carl Jung around shame and the shadow. But this is a quote from him, it's kind of an intense quote, but shame is a soul-eating emotion. And according to Jung, every person carries a shadow, and the less it is embodied in the individual's conscious life, the denser it is. Shame is viewed as an intense soul-eating emotion, which can impact negatively on the individual. So every person has a shadow. Every zodiac sign has a shadow. And so I think getting to know the shadow of that sign can also be a way of unshaming that sign or that house. So we could talk about the shadow of the first house, what that might look like, and how integrating that could be useful. Um, that was helpful for me to learn, like what Heidi Rose Robbins would refer to as the wretched state of each sign, and embodying that and allowing yourself to act it out.
Hmm.
Um, this is where I think Leo again and the sun is connected to these themes of shame, because Leo is acting things out. It is embodying things through play. And so what would it be like for you to exaggerate your first house placements in their most wretched state? Like just making it a caricature, making it over the top. What might you learn in that process of exploring the shadow of that placement? Um,
Ooh,
do you,
what's the wretched state of Aquarius?
oh my gosh. I mean, so to use those languages again of like excess and deficiency, it can go like, I think there's different forms of shadow. But the excess of Aquarius is like being too tapped in at all times, like listening to everyone else's perspective, wanting to take everything into consideration, wanting to please everyone. I think for me as an Aquarius sun, I'm very interested in social justice movements, equality, liberation for all people. If I am taking in all of humanity's stories, I lose my own voice and
Mhm.
it gets exasperated. And since Pluto entered Aquarius the second time at the beginning of this year, 2024, I put my podcast on pause, and it's on pause all year because I
Wow.
really need to come back to myself. Um, Aquarius needs to leave the group in order to communicate with a group. Like I have this kind of pendulum swinging back and forth throughout my life. When I launched my podcast 7 years ago, it was because I did a whole year of like soul searching and I got really clear on what my unique vibration was. And I use that word for Aquarius a lot because the glyph looks like little vibration marks. So this is a message for all of us with Pluto and Aquarius, is needing to really get clear on what our own unique vibration is so that we can share our messages out with other people to help elevate our vibration. When we're doom scrolling on social media, this is a shadow of Aquarius. It's like
Mhm.
taking on the vibration of everyone else around you, but is that vibration activating and awakening our soul potential to grow and to evolve, or is it exasperating our trauma? Hello, Pluto.
Mm.
So yeah, the shadow of Aquarius, it takes on the energy of everything that's around it. So it needs to get very clear on what its own unique purpose is
Yeah.
here to serve.
Yeah. I feel like something that I enjoy doing with Unshaming the Signs is like, so thinking about the rising, the sign of the first house being a place to begin thinking about unshaming the first house is feeling into like whatever the wretched state is, like that it's the conditioning of overculture that has moved us away from whatever the joy state, or like the beautifully empowered state of a sign is. Like, it's not that there's something wrong with us, but that there's shame coming so much from overculture that things got turned in a way that felt like unskillful. And then the more we shame ourselves for it, the more it just increases. And it's like the only way through is compassion, is what I feel to be true.
Mm, yeah, I'm curious how much overlap with the signs the houses will hold, because we often talk about like first house being associated with Aries themes. So
Mm-hmm.
when exploring the first house, if is that course still available for people, the signs? Like, is that
Oh,
something?
yes, it is. And many listeners may have come also to the individual workshops, but for anyone new to the project, you can go to just like my link in bio, and you can get either the individual workshops, Gemini's, for free, or you can get the whole thing, and it's like priced at 9 for the price of 12, but they're 2-hour workshops. And ultimately what we do in it is inner child healing,
Oh, wow.
because to me, unshaming is basically the same thing as inner child healing. And it's creating a line of communication with
Mm,
that part of you that is still back in the past,
yeah.
back when you were originally witnessed as bad, and
Yeah.
still sees through the world from that place of there being a problem with us.
Yeah. Which
Yeah,
is
go
like,
ahead.
that's for me, that's another Leo theme, is inner child.
Yeah,
And
that's right.
I do feel a lot of Leo with this topic, which is
Yeah,
um
yeah.
yeah, so it would be, I think, beneficial for anyone who is wanting to unshame the first house to look at what sign you have in the first house, and then maybe even explore that talk that you had in tandem with first house themes.
Mhm.
Um, because there's some layering happening when we get into the houses of what sign is there too. And I'm also curious of how much in common these themes of unshaming the first house might have in common with Aries, being that Aries is the first sign too.
Yeah.
There's many different topics within the first house, like even just physical appearance is something like the signification of the first house. So a question for reflection we might have when unshaming the first house is um, stream of consciousness. Like, what body part do you hold the most shame about? And just trusting what wants to flow through first, and then exploring that body part would be interesting.
Oh, good.
Yeah.
Another one I think comes up a lot with first house is I think of it as like how we approach things. You
Yeah.
could say how we approach life, but how you're kind of how you approach anything.
Yeah.
And I think that I know for myself, I always like get away from myself whenever I'm comparing how someone else approaches things from how I want to approach it.
Mhm.
And like shame shows up when I immediately presume the other person is going to
Yeah.
be doing it better, or that there's something about their approach that is like more adult. Um,
Mhm.
Usually, like I'll shame myself for Aries things, like I jumped in impulsively. I jumped in like without thinking about it. I'm approaching it too bluntly, like, oh, I don't have any diplomacy, and I'm not smoothing out the edges. I just jumped in. I probably like made them run away because they were like, whoa, this person comes on so strong. Um, those
Yeah.
are some of the things that I've always
Yeah.
felt,
Yeah.
even before I knew I was Aries rising.
So how does learning that you're an Aries rising help you lean into the traits of Aries and not be ashamed of, the fact that you might go head first into things and approach
Mhm.
life in a way that others may project onto, which is seventh house, right? But there's a sense of where I do think that astrology holds the potential to gift people permission to embody the parts of themselves that they might be ashamed of.
Yeah,
It's that for me, for sure. And
absolutely.
yeah. So can you also see the compassion and the joy in your approach to life too, on the
Mhm.
flip side?
Yeah, a keyword that came up with unshaming the signs was audacity, and it rolled in on sign one, Aries,
Hmm.
having audacity.
Hmm.
And over time, I realized like actually, audacity is not just an Aries thing. It's just helpful for all unshaming because it again speaks to that permission piece of having the audacity to be the one to forgive yourself, having the audacity to just say, this is the way I do things.
Yeah.
And so I think that now all the time, I think that's kind of people's takeaway from me is like I hear a lot, thank you for your audacity. Thank you for helping me feel into my audacity. And
Mhm.
so that's me living my Aries rising and like turning the story. So now it feels so super supportive to both me and to those that I engage with.
Yeah.
But it's also, I'm sure, leads to many unfollows and unsubscribes, and that's okay too. I
Yeah.
have to keep moving forward with my bold medicine, and
Mhm.
that's living my Aries rising
For
without
sure.
shame.
Yeah. When I think of Aries and when I think of the first house, we've talked about the seventh house, but there's something in those hard angles to the fourth and 10th house that I think are
Mhm.
also important, of just, one's public appearance and career with 10th house and also one's upbringing and family with the fourth house that I think does form this kind of hard angle to the very sense of self and who we are in the world. And, what kind of shame have we inherited from our upbringing? What kind of shame do we have about the person that we are putting ourselves out into the world as, or our career? I do think exploring the 10th, 4th, and 7th for the first house feels important too. Yeah.
Yeah, I really recognize that a lot too. And sometimes, like I was thinking about this with the 10th house, that we might have these ideas or these pictures in our mind or these pictures we've inherited from the overculture around who that 10th version of us is supposed to be. But it feels to me like I become that version of myself the more clear I am with my first house pathway.
Yeah.
Like
Yeah.
the 10th house emerges more clearly when I'm not fixated on it,
Right.
but I'm staying with the first. On on its own accord.
Yeah. Yeah. One way that I talk about the first house that may be unique to my practice, but I think there's other astrologers who communicate about the first house in this way, and the rising sign is it's that which we are waking up to within ourselves. And so it's our rising potential throughout our lifetime. And so I think there's a lot of significations of the first house that are more about like the personality or like the physical appearance. But from a soul-centered perspective, esoteric perspective, even an evolutionary perspective, the rising sign can even represent like the higher self or the super conscious part of the self, which is a different way of interacting with the rising sign than I think maybe everyone interacts with it. Do you ever connect to the rising sign in that way?
Yeah, I think, yeah, I really do. It sort of flips the script a little for me, given that there's something so like uh baby warrior about a 3 degrees of Aries
Mhm.
being my higher self,
Yeah.
Plus, not to mention I have South Node 3 degrees away, which kind of
Mhm.
makes the story a little more complicated. But it certainly has revealed to be true through the evidence of living that trusting in my Aries takes the rest of my chart to new places and the rest of me to new places that I like where it's going as I do this.
Yeah.
Uh, it's also interesting to think about the relationship here with the placement of the planet that rules your rising sign.
Mhm.
I don't know about your practice, but
Yeah.
I talk about the chart ruler
Yeah.
as and the placement of the chart ruler as being really significant in helping you to live the rising sign more supportively, bringing more momentum to the helm.
Mhm.
And so, yeah, it could be interesting then to notice like the shame that may live in the sign and house of the planet that rules your rising sign as a place to look at like finding like relief or finding unshaming through that planet and the significations of that placement. Does that
Yeah.
resonate for you in your chart?
Yeah, for sure. And I would love to hear if you feel like sharing where your Mars placement
Yeah.
is. Yeah.
In Cancer,
Ooh,
in the fourth house.
okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So that's it's like an interesting place. You can read that in a lot of ways, but one of the ways that it's been coming to me lately, and especially vis-a-vis unshaming, is if you think about Cancer in the fourth house as family and upbringing, um, unshaming, sort of like my resistance and conflict with family of origin, um, allowing myself to experience the frustration and irritation that I for a long time muted and
Mhm.
dissociated from,
Mhm.
like coming into letting myself feel all those things has opened, I feel, my capacity to come into more of my Aries self
Mhm.
because it does want so much of my like energy. And so being dissociated from those kind of less comfortable feelings made it difficult for me, I think, to really be the bold Aries rising woman that I am.
Mhm.
Um, yeah, that's
Yeah. Um, yeah, I mean, I can feel into the Mars and Cancer in the fourth house and in many different ways. I mean, for one, it even makes sense of this topic and how we're like going in there and into like this deeper part of this maybe more emotional side
Mhm,
of astrology conversation. As
mhm,
I was preparing for this talk today, I was like, oh God, I'm having to go in there and like look at my shame. Like this is what, like I feel like Mars in the fourth house is like, I sometimes think of Mars can like excavate and like kind of like
Mm.
dig in somewhere, wherever it is, especially like in a water sign, like, like looking for water somehow, letting the water come out. I with Mars in Cancer, I also think of in some ways it could be removing yourself from your family of origin in some way,
Mhm.
which Aries risings often do anyway. But then
Mhm.
having Mars in Cancer just furthers that conversation around actually physically removing yourself from your inherited family that allows you to step into the person that you're meant to be in this lifetime. Um, it could even mean like taking the road less traveled or like not following the traditional rules of your family, like figuring out your own way of doing things, but then becoming a mother yourself. And like that's a way that you channel it too. I mean, there's so many ways that you could connect into it, but um, when I hear Mars and Cancer, that's what it makes me think of. Yeah, yeah,
Yeah, I think and I do think a Mars in the fourth can often have a kind of buried rage that at some point it's really helpful to excavate that. And
mhm,
I deeply resonate with that because, it wasn't that long ago that I would be like, oh, I have no rage. It was just like a cutoff. I'm
yeah,
laughing, but it's very intense.
yeah, yeah,
Um,
yeah,
but I do think that the more I go there, which is also deeply supported by inner child healing, and just like speaking to the younger me who was very confused.
yeah,
Um, that all just kind of the lightness that comes in and just kind of opens things up for me.
mhm,
I feel like energy is returned. And then with that energy, I have more to thrust into the world
mhm,
with what I'm passionate about, which is the Aries.
yeah.
What about you? Your Saturn, I feel like, is in Sag, right?
Yes. And, I also work with both Saturn and Uranus,
Mm-hmm.
rulers
Yes.
for Aquarius. Um, I think really because they're conjunct in my chart, they're just
It's easy.
with each other. So I'm like, well, I'm working with both anyway, so I get to build a bridge between the traditional and modern rulers for Aquarius. Yeah, and they're in Sagittarius in my 11th house. So I think when I think of shame and unshaming my first house, which has my sun in Aquarius too. So both my sun and rising are looking to both Saturn and Uranus and Sag in the 11th. I makes me think of my upbringing too, but more through the lens of being born into a religious system that Sagittarius being religion and just community's 11th house that in some ways was very strict Saturnian, being from an evangelical Christian background, being indoctrinated into a belief set, and then me just being this Aquarius sun in the first house that is here to disrupt the system and the status quo and to just shine my light as a unique individual that is interested in freedom and liberation of self and any constraints that are put on me, while at the same time I've then used that to become a teacher and to hold space for groups and communities around philosophy. And um, I think I'm always checking back in to make sure that I'm not perpetuating this sort of white saviorism, evangelical perspective as an astrologer. Like it's part of my work to never force anyone into this language, to let people find it on their own. But that can be a challenge for me too, because I do see the world through the lens of astrology. So I'm always wanting to talk about it. Like sometimes I'm like, okay, can you go on a walk with this friend and not bring up astrology right now? You know what I mean? So
Is
like
that possible?
yeah. And so yeah, I think things that maybe people don't know that I don't share often is how intense my dynamics is with religion. Like I I have had to set very clear boundaries with no contact with family members who are just like relentless in their pursuit to get me to accept Jesus into my heart, and how they place onto me that I'm going to hell for the work that I'm doing, and writing me long letters just saying that they're praying for me, and just like all of these things that in order for me to show up as the person that I've had to set really clear like Saturnian boundaries around my own belief systems. Um, so that's how Saturn and Sag has manifested for me, and has created a lot of shame around who I am and the work that I do in the world, because it's so
Mhm.
like worldly, Sagittarius 11th house.
Mhm.
Um, and that I have to be very strict in some ways around who I let into my sphere, so that I can show up and do the work that I do in the world. But I also, um, yeah, so I think that's how it manifests for me. I'll just leave it there for now. But
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think for chart lovers, chart nerds, chart curious listeners, I'd even feel like you can keep going. Like if um like looking at my chart, the that Mars in Cancer is ruled by
Yeah.
Moon in Capricorn, my career.
Mhm.
Then that's ruled by Saturn and Leo in the fifth,
Mhm.
and then that's ruled by Sun and Pisces in the 12th, and then that goes to Jupiter and Gemini in the third, which goes back to Mercury in Pisces, and it's kind of a mutual reception there.
Yeah.
But I feel like through kind of like all of those loops, the story of shame
Mhm.
continues, and the unshaming is also possible
Yeah.
through a compassionate, expansive, trusting relationship with those planets. Um, I feel an emergent joy and openness
Mhm.
in being alive and being myself. That comes back to like give energy to the Aries rising.
Yeah. Yeah, I call that the cosmic cookie crumb trail, when you just like follow the ruling planet. I can't remember the actual term for it now. There is like there's a name for that practice. Um, um, and Saturn and Leo makes so much sense to me with this topic. Again, just like unshaming feels very Saturn and Leo to me, actually. Like that's part of your work. Yeah.
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 Yeah, that's probably part of it. Um, and
What
I
house is it in?
the
Oh,
fifth.
fifth house, yeah.
Yeah, and if we think about that as where I'm parenting, uh, it has been one of the huge rel reliefs of my life to feel my own parenting of my daughters relax through unshaming, as I notice I'm able to set boundaries with them. I'm not second guessing like um, every single choice that I make as a parent, not apologizing for my needs.
Mhm.
And playfulness has emerged.
Yeah. I
I remember my little daughter, and she was like age 3 or 4, tearing up saying that I don't play with her. Why don't you play with me? And I just remember thinking, I don't, I don't know how, you know.
yeah.
I like couldn't relax enough
Yeah.
to just play.
Yeah. And have you had any openings there?
Yeah, it's like when I was focused on trying to relax, trying to be a better player, it
Mhm.
wasn't helping. It was like it needed to relax, and all through the chart, like all through me,
Hmm.
playing just kind of became kind of opened up as a natural consequence
Yeah.
of the relieving the like the compulsion to fix myself, or the compulsion to prove myself, which is another consequence of shame. The three consequences are lack of self-trust, compulsion to fix self, and feeling like you don't have permission to set boundaries, you don't have permission to be yourself. And so as the compulsions to fix or prove myself relaxed, kind of a natural byproduct of that was like an ease and a softness in my very being self, which is very Leo to me, ready to play more, you know?
Yeah, good. I'm
Yeah.
starting to go to like maybe some other houses now where I'm like, ooh, what is like the societal implications of like stigmas that are placed on people and how that relates to shame? I think that's like maybe connecting us to a later house. Uh,
Yeah.
I think there will be a strong resonance for the fifth house on shaming the fifth house. I do,
Mm-hmm.
yeah. So
Yeah.
I'm excited to listen to that episode too, and excited to see who you choose for all these other houses as well. Yeah, and how that.
Yeah. Yeah. I know. I was telling you before we press record, I've been in a little bit in a grief process lately and haven't been able to reach out to anybody since I reached out to you, but that will shift soon, and I will let you know who comes on. Um, yeah, is there anything else? One other thing I was thinking about is like we talked some about sun in the first house.
Mm-hmm.
Do you see things with like say moon in the first house that
Yeah,
related to shame? I'm curious. Or
yeah.
other placements like Saturn in the first house, Pluto in the first house.
Oh my
Any
gosh,
that come up for you in
Saturn in the
this?
first house for sure. Like, yeah, um, yeah. I mean, and this you could look at all the planets through the lens of unshaming too, which I feel like might be your next series, your next series after the houses. But yeah, I think whatever is in the first house, it just brings it so much into the forefront of the self, whether that's your approach to life, your self-image. Um, and I have a list of first house significations that
Yeah.
could just nice for us to be reminded of. So these are the ones that I wrote down: was self-image, physical appearance, first impressions, personality, approach to life, attitude, how we navigate the world, our outlook, independence, initiative, leadership, drive, courage, confidence, personal goals, desires, identity development. The house of self-discovery is what I like to refer to it a lot too.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So whatever planet you have in the first house, it brings it into the forefront of the self, which when we're talking about unshaming or shame, is so much connected to the self already. So the themes of that planet will likely come into dialogue and conversation. And so since you brought up the moon, it could be similar to some of the fourth house themes that we were talking about, since the moon is associated with Cancer in the fourth house, but there could be something around, you know, family dynamics, something around security and comfort. It could be intuition, like there could be like not trusting in the intuition. Something with family dynamics could be something underneath the surface, like subconscious or unconscious going on. So that's how I would approach whatever planet is in the first house. Um, I mean, we could go deeper into it, but as I'm bringing up some of these first house themes in the moon, what does that bring up for you? And have you witnessed that in
Yeah,
anyone's?
I was thinking about it, and one of the things I was thinking about is I feel that with those that I've known over the years now with Moon in the first, there's this kind of sense with them that one can have that this could be the kind of person who could really hear me, hold me, attune to me. They look like they could take care of me, in that nurturing moon way. And I think that because we have I think, a failure of attunement in our culture. Like, I think just so many of us walk around not having been fully attuned to, as children, and have parents who may have never not been fully attuned to. There can often be like a pull on those who present as individuals who can connect emotionally
Mhm.
and see you emotionally.
Mhm.
And then also in our culture, we have these expectations on caregivers, and we have a good bad binary around like, you're good if you care, and you're bad if you don't give care.
Mhm.
And so what I wonder for those listening who have Moon in the first is if it might feel like your identity became being that person who's like the one that people can lean on emotionally,
Yeah.
and feeling like the only way to not be a bad person if you don't have the energy for that is to self-isolate or get away from people,
Mhm.
because that's can feel like the only choice for you. Otherwise, you're a bad person if you're not constantly giving your attunement. um yeah, I don't know, does that resonate?
Yeah, I mean, and it's like how do you navigate that polarity of like either being in people's life and being a caretaker or just completely isolating? So it made me think of the high priestess in the tarot that sits between two columns, one's dark, one's light, and the high priestess is the card that's associated with the moon.
Mhm.
Which this could be like I'm always using tarot to meditate too, um, in tandem with my astrology practice. So that's something that you could do to um,
Yeah.
just deepen your connection to any placements you have in the first house is to pull out the tarot card that it's associated with. The sun, of course, is the sun card, which actually did pop up in my mind when you were talking about inner child healing, which, I think the sun card is very connected to the themes of what we're talking about, which usually shows a kid completely in the nude riding a horse. Um, but yeah, the moon in the first house, it brings a depth to these topics, really. And I'm feeling the phases of the moon. Sometimes the moon is more internal. Sometimes it's more like reflecting back when it's full versus when it's new. So wherever the moon is in a chart, you can go through different cycles in your life too. And so
Yeah.
giving the self permission to be in process and to allow oneself to change and um, to listen to the intuitive wisdom of one's body, that one's body might even be fluctuating with moon in the first house, or even their appearance. It's like sometimes you show up and you're like mama bear, other times you show up and you're much more internal or you're in a process of healing. So just giving yourself permission to be fluid. Yeah.
Totally. I can totally see that one for
Yeah.
Moon. You know, even though we did talk about sun, I will say that I
Uh-huh.
don't know that I've ever met anyone with sun in the first house that is like super comfortable and excited to find out that out, and to like feel into like, what does that even mean? Does that mean I'm supposed to be super visible?
Yeah.
Because most of the sun in the first house folks that I've spent time with actually really uncomfortable with the idea of visibility and having to hold that solar light brightly.
Mhm.
Um, do you see that too?
Yeah, I think that's interesting because it's like if the sun is in the first or whatever is in the first, it is likely in some way forming a square to the midheaven too. So it just like there is this hard angle that's created, but they're supportive of one another too. But it's like as an Aquarius rising, I have a Scorpio midheaven. So there's a
Mhm.
tension there between the two. Um, I One way that I interpret having sun in the first house is I'm on a journey of self-discovery throughout my lifetime. That is part of my journey because that's how I connect to the first house. That me exploring my own identity, my own beliefs, my own way of being is part of who I am, and it gives me energy and light to be in that process. Vitality. Yeah.
Mm. Yeah, I love that.
Yeah.
It's like if it's a journey of self-discovery, it feels like it's gives you permission to not have figured it out, like there's no figuring out. Like you're not supposed to already know what it's like to be a big son in this world.
Yeah.
The journey of understanding
Mhm.
the self. Yeah.
Yeah. And that's how I connect to the rising sign too, is that it's like you're learning about this sign for the rest of your life
Yeah.
and that there is no figuring it out.
That's right.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
What transits or progressions would you say feel for you to be those kinds of eh, windows of time where you might be invited to um into awareness of the shame that may be present and into being with the parts of you that hold shame, or confronting those parts, or learning to be more compassionate with those parts of you?
I actually do think, I mean, anything that transits your ascendant is going to invite you into these themes. And that's why the
Mhm.
first house feels so important for this topic. That if you're having Saturn transit your first house, like this like it likely a lot of these themes will be coming to the forefront of your mind. Or for you, like having Chiron transiting the first house,
Mhm.
knowing you're an early degree Aries, I'm like, oh, Neptune and Saturn are coming too. And
Yep.
also, you mentioned you have your South node there. So I'm also like happy nodal opposition to you. There's just a lot of energy in Aries right now. And so I think anything transiting, it doesn't even have to be the ascendant, just hanging out in your first house is going to
Mhm.
bring these topics of unshaming and shame um, into your own personal experience. Um, One of the transits I'm looking out for in 2025 that I'm intrigued by, because we were talking about earlier how Chiron is, I was saying I think Chiron's deeply connected to these themes of shame.
Yes.
But I do think looking at where Chiron is in your chart during one's Chiron return, these themes are coming up, and how shame is inherently connected to inner child healing, which I do think Chiron is too. Uh, I often refer to Chiron in our chart, and wherever it's transiting to is where we learn how to compartmentalize our trauma through our intellectual and spiritual pursuits, but where we
Whoa.
also learn to like open, like, Chiron, the glyph is the key, so we can like put our trauma in a drawer, close it, and lock it and compartmentalize it. But also Chiron transits have us opening the drawer and like unpacking things too. Which when we're talking about unshaming, it's like opening the drawer,
Yeah.
looking at the stuff. So I am curious for you of just even having Chiron and Aries at this time and how you're doing all of this unshaming, like Chiron in your first house, like that feels like part of the work too. Um,
Mhm.
and I'd be curious when transiting Chiron is like trying your natal Saturn or like something like that. I'd also look to the other like the aspects that things are making in one's chart. Um, but yeah, I'll pause there. I could talk more and more. I could riff off of Chiron, but I want to give you space to respond to some of it because I saw you nodding some too.
Oh, I just love what you were saying so much about Chiron and the key and the opening of the drawer. Um, I found from space holding and community with this project that it's kind of like you just kind of got to get start. Once you get started, it can be so uncomfortable, at the beginning. But because um because the origins of shame have to do with a witness, it's usually because someone was looking at us being in trouble or
Yeah,
something,
yeah, yeah.
someone witnessing us as bad,
Mhm.
that it is through community that so much unshaming can happen, like very, very quickly,
Yeah.
because of the intense vulnerability that comes up when we're willing to talk about our shame.
Mhm.
Um, And I learned that vulnerability means our capacity to be wounded. So it's sharing your capacity to be wounded, which of course is to be human. And it's kind of like being willing to open that drawer, but with other people, just kind of like rapidly
Mm.
creates this flowering of unshaming, because it's in the witnessing from others of our capacity to be human that shame just begins to flower into something else, which I think then becomes the very beautiful thing that we can offer other people, which to me is very Chiron,
Mhm.
of like the medicine coming from that drawer. Like you got to
Yeah,
open the drawer, that's where it is.
yeah, yeah. Yeah. Yeah, and that part that you said of like someone placing like bad on you is like
Mhm.
inherent in Chiron's story and just the conception of Chiron. And something I'm always intrigued about is when people often recap Chiron's story, there's maybe more of a focus on Chiron being abandoned by the mother, but not really talking about, no, actually, Chiron was abandoned by the father too.
Mhm.
And just, his the way that he was conceived was through, there's many different versions of the story, but essentially it was like not a planned birth, or it was like not a married couple, or whatever, however you want to communicate about it. But some might say, like, trigger warning, that like Chiron's father, Saturn, raped his mother, or maybe they were drunken and like had an affair. Like there's a lot of different interpretations of that story, but essentially, um, Saturn turned himself into a horse, and then Chiron to run away from it, and then Chiron was born half horse, half human, and they didn't know what to do with him. He was a reminder of the betrayal and the hurt, and so he was abandoned to the woods. So it's like already like, bad, Chiron, you're bad. Like you're not meant to be here. Or like there's something wrong with you, or you're a reminder of the mistakes of our past. So you remind me of my own shame. So Chiron's story can be how you might mirror back to your own parents, their shame or whatever. So yeah, I mean, Chiron in your chart is going to speak to all of these themes, and where we learn to heal our abandonment wounds through inner child healing and through deep soul work and through psychology and therapy, all forms of therapy, somatic healing, physical therapy. I mean, some of these things can even show up with our physical body too. Um, so yeah, definitely looking to Chiron and Chiron transits and Chiron return and all of these things. And Chiron next year in 2025 forms a conjunction with Eris. They will meet at
They're
25
together next
degrees,
year. Mm.
25 degrees of Aries, for like a big portion of the year, because Eris moves very slowly. And yeah, so I'm keeping an eye out on that, um, particularly healing around feminist movements, because Eris for me is feminist movements. So a lot of it feels connected to the political climate of this year, um, whether it's like the first female president of the United States, or whether it's like Project 25 rolling out. Like either way, like Chiron Eris conjunction, it's like we can feel that tension of, just collective feminism, Eris, and healing the wounds and trauma of the past, Chiron. Meanwhile, Pluto's in Aquarius, and I think Pluto in Aquarius is also speaking a lot to what you're talking about, of like the group work of being seen in groups. And so while Pluto's in Aquarius, like this is also important for us to be witnessed and seen and held in community containers as we're processing a lot.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Speaking of Pluto, I do think Pluto in the first um, can be like kind of that same picture of like how with Chiron it being a drawer, I feel like with Pluto in the first, folks that I know, there can be this kind of play around concealing and revealing, and like that, like the journey and the life being around, well, among many things, but one of them is like something I see with a lot of my beloved Pluto in the first humans is either an insistence on being like an above world being and like, no, there's no underworld, none at all.
Yeah.
Or being like, I'm an underworld being, and I don't know how in the world anyone lives above ground. I'm just not capable of living above ground, you know? And like part of the unshaming process can, I think, come through
Mhm.
in proper timing, because I think Pluto so much, it's like all about when the invitation comes at the right time to bring the above world and the below world into communication. Mhm.
Wow. Yeah. The integration of that. And I think when we're exploring these planets,
Mhm.
Italy in the first house, you can also think of the transits too. And so if you don't have sun in the first house, there will be 30 days throughout the year that the sun is moving through your first house. So that is
Yes.
also a time for you to connect to that. Or once a month or month, the moon will be moving through your first house. So, you could follow the moon throughout a month and follow the unshaming of the houses every 2.5 days, switch houses and just kind of go on a journey that way. And I'm thinking of that because as an Aquarius rising, it's like, oh, now what you're talking about is someone who might have Pluto in their first house in their natal chart. I'm like, oh, yeah, that's me right now. Like
All right.
like,
Two decades.
am I in the underworld and
Are
not
you?
acknowledging what's going on in the world around us, or am I just like ignoring the hell realms and pretending like it doesn't exist? But it is about the integration of the two. That's what I'm learning right now, is bringing the darkness and the light together with Pluto in the first house. So that was helpful to hear your interpretation of someone who might have Pluto in their first house in their natal chart and how I might be living that for the next 20 years as
Mhm. Yeah,
yeah.
and I suppose if you think about the sun, your sun being at the eastern horizon at your birth, in many ways, it's still a life invitation because your sun was like
Mhm.
deciding to move from the below to the above.
Right.
And I do feel like a lot of sun and first house humans I know, there's almost like it was so nice and dark down in there. Do I really have to get out there? You know,
Mhm.
do I
Yeah.
really have to go do this day world thing? Um, and yeah, so yeah, maybe that's will be part of your journey with Pluto through the first. If I'm living long enough, I might experience that, but I don't
Yeah.
know. We'll see.
Yeah.
Is there anything else that you can think of to presence on the
Mm.
topic of unshaming the first house?
I did write a list of synonyms for unshaming that could just be
Ooh,
a nice way of just like reframing it or looking at it from a new perspective.
I love it.
Yeah, self-love,
There you go.
self-acceptance, empowerment, self-compassion, healing, self-respect. It was a lot. I don't know if it's the first house or what, but there was a lot of self words were coming up for me when I was trying to tune into what is unshaming. Uh,
Mhm.
yeah, self-worth. Yeah. What about you? What does unshaming mean to you?
Yeah, I think self-compassion is like the first door, and ultimately it comes into self-love. But I think for many who may feel themselves at the beginning of unshaming, self-love might feel like impossible, you
Mhm.
know? Um, it's funny, we're back at Leo again.
Uh-huh.
Um, but compassion can often feel more um, like a doable step.
Yeah.
And another thing I'll say, just to support the community aspect of it, is sometimes I think self-compassion or self-love may feel impossible, but when you witness others um, trying to like sharing in their vulnerability, and your heart is like literally going out to them, like you feel your heart going out to people, um, and it's like you can feel yourself wanting this other person to see how you see them,
Yeah.
which is through this lens of expansive compassion.
Mhm.
And what starts to happen over time, I think, is realizing that if you can give that to all the other people in the room with you,
Mhm.
um, inevitably, what might it be like to give that to yourself? And um,
Mhm.
so I do think unshaming is can certainly happen in private.
Mhm.
But one thing we know is that shame grows in secrecy and shame grows in isolation. And so by that by that logic, then unshaming self-compassion often can come through community.
Yeah. Yeah. Which is making me think of the polarity to live
Right.
Aquarius. Yeah.
Yeah.
And Aquarius, we could also say, is connected to podcasting and just you creating this platform to share with other people, whether or not we're gathering together in person in community, but also just to receive the conversation that we're having too, um, can begin to open doors up for people to step into maybe IRL community, but just having the conversation and is beginning the journey of self-compassion. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you for pointing that out. I do think podcasts can have um, you can feel profoundly connected,
Mhm.
even if it's asynchronous spatially and temporally.
Yeah.
It's like the human voice transmission
Mhm.
does something in our bodies, and that kind of bodily opening moves things around, and makes more things possible than we might have thought.
Yeah.
So thank you. That said, thank you for giving your time and your genius
Yeah.
to this new project,
Yeah.
kicking it off with me
Yeah.
and getting it going. Appreciate it so much.
Yeah. Thanks for inviting me, and it was an honor to connect with you in this way. And I just adore you so much, and enjoyed our time together.
I adore you too. Anything you want to share about you got coming up, or
Sure. Yeah,
how can
sure.
people connect to your work?
Yeah, so as I was saying, I had a podcast for about 6.5 years. It's currently on pause, which feels good for me at the moment. I do miss it, which is good. And I have a Substack and a newsletter. So cosmiccousins.com, you can find me there. I offer one-on-one support long term for mentorships. That's like the heart of my practice is there's some clients I've been seeing every other week for 3 years. So that's big part
Wow.
of my practice. And I'll also be releasing pretty soon some information about course containers for this fall. So if you are wanting to deepen your studies, you could check out my website and sign up for my newsletter, and you'll be the first to find out. I'm also on the IG still, reluctantly and trying to find the play in it all, but I'm still on Instagram too. Yeah.
Well, my reading with you is one of my all-time favorite readings. I
Why
just love that
is that?
so
I'm so
much.
curious. Why is that?
I just feel like we went on this journey. You, I just felt like you were so thoughtful about really feeling into it and taking me there with you. Um, yeah, the way it flowed. I just think it's your big heart. It
Mm,
just comes out through your voice. And I just loved being seen by you.
yeah.
Um, yeah. And I'll never forget you called my asteroids my fairies. Fairies at the top of the chart.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah.
And I don't think I'd realized about my Pallas Neptune. And really, and I hadn't really thought about it until you talked with me about it, and that's when Neptune was on my Venus. You maybe didn't know, but it was a really important time in my life. And
Yeah.
so having your space holding in my life when I was super transitional, I was like living at my mom's house at the time.
Oh yeah.
Um, it was like the support I needed to boost me into new chapter, you know?
Yeah.
So thank
And
you.
I do think the asteroids, aka the fairies in the chart, um, really can offer a lot into unshaming. I do think that their
Good
themes
idea.
are are re- can really help connect us to self-love, self-compassion, to healing, all of those things. So getting to
Mhm.
know your asteroids in your chart um, could offer a new perspective, and that is something that I specialize in, is
Yeah, do
connecting.
you still have that offering at your website? I invested in your asteroid class.
I have taken it off of my website
Mhm.
because at some point I want to re-release it, but
Mhm.
um, if people send me an email requesting it, I'll turn them away. Yeah. Um, But yeah, I do have a deep dive container that explores the four main asteroids, but I've since started introducing new asteroids into my practice too,
Oh,
like
wow.
Hygeia and White Moon Selene has been lit
Hmm.
this year because she was part of the Jupiter-Uranus conjunction in Taurus. So I've been paying attention to her this year. And of course, Eris, not an asteroid, more of a planetoid. Eris is conjunct my North Node in Aries. So I for sure am working with Eris as well. Yeah. So I believe that this fall I'm going to be releasing a workshop download on Eris to help deepen people's connection to it because she is so active in 2025 with Chiron conjunction. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I'll be definitely getting that because I don't have any planets in my first house except um planetoid or whatever Eris is.
Yeah.
Whatever Eris is.
Yeah.
That is in my
Exactly.
first house.
I mean, I could riff on your Eris in the first house for a long time. I
I
feel it.
bet you could.
Feel it. Yeah. So, yeah, what degree is she at? Do you remember?
She's opposite my Pluto.
Oh, wow.
It's either like 14 or 15 or 16.
Yeah. I mean, that
Yeah,
is a
Pluto's at
signature
16.
for most of you with Pluto and Libra, right? This having that opposition
Right.
person Aries. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Mhm. Yeah, that's interesting. And another kind of practice that I've been getting into recently is a facet of degree theory where each degree is connected to a different zodiac sign. And that has been flavoring a lot of texture for me in my practice.
Oh,
Yeah.
wow. Can you give an example? Like what?
You said your Aries rising at the third degree?
3.
Yeah, so
Mhm.
that's the Gemini degree.
I see what you mean.
Yeah.
Oh.
Yeah, so it would create conversation around your gifts of communication and
Oh.
collaboration. And it would highlight here we are talking and you're having a different guest on each time. So yeah, it would give you a little bit more texture to that Aries. And yeah, like for instance, one of my good friends, Brandon, who is the host of the Spiritual Gaze podcast with his husband Angel, were born a day apart. I'm Sun in Aquarius at the Aries degree, and Brandon is Sun in Aquarius at the Taurus degree, just the day after me. And it's like so true to our nature of just like
Ah,
Aries and Taurus expressions of Aquarius. So it's kind of a rabbit hole, but I think it's like the next step for someone who has been studying astrology for a while and needs like a little bit of new like ingredient spice into their birth chart. So yeah, yeah.
very cool. Um, did are you creating this, or have you seen this before? Um,
It has been brought to my attention by another astrologer named Ariel, uh, who introduced me to the topic. But as an Aquarius with Mars in Aries, and also I'm progressed Sun and rising in Aries right now, I it's sort of like a new concept can come to me and I just like launch off with it.
go.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah. Well, that'll be fun to play with. Yeah.
yeah.
Well, thank you.
Thank
Thank
you.
you so much,
Yeah,
Jeff.
it's fun.
And yeah, I look forward to playing it back and re-listening again with you. Thank
Yeah,
you.
thank you.
Thank you, thank you, thank you, Jeff. Thank you for bringing your heart to Moon to Moon. Listeners, to connect with Jeff, you can use the links that I'm putting in the show notes to follow Jeff on Instagram and to connect with his work through their website. So, on Shaming the First House, what did that bring up for you? What did that bring up for you? What questions, what stories, what contemplations are on your heart? I hope you'll reach out to Jeff and or to me to share anything that came up for you. I hope you found it supportive and engaging in your own pathway, whether you're new to unshaming or you've been following along with me for quite some time. If this was your first introduction to my work on unshaming, I'm inviting you to go back to the last episode to catch up a little bit on the origins of my project. And if you are not following me on Instagram, I encourage you to go there to find all the tiles that I've been creating since Aries 2023 on unshaming each of the signs. And you can also go to any of the workshop recordings from last year's workshops. They're extremely potent asynchronously, and it will help you to drop in deeper, deeper, and deeper into unshaming and also learn the basic practices for unshaming in your regular daily mundane life, on the go as a human being, as a terrestrial being. This is really a project for humans who are humaning here with the support of this this powerful language. So thank you. Thank you for being here, and I hope you will continue to tune in as I bring forward more Unshaming the Houses episodes with other guest astrologers. I'm so proud and excited to be doing this. All right. Sending you lots of love.